successfully for us. So, um, uh, all that is to say that cards like Molten Giant and Blade Flurry, at some point, there are some number of players who have only experienced the new version. For those players, we're changing it again. Some number of players were only played in the old version, and actually, this would help them come back to Hearthstone if they come back and it's what they remember. So there's pros and cons. I think there's messaging we have to do to teach everybody these things that don't that I'm not sure is great. And also, for some of these cards, specifically Molten Giant and Blade Flurry, there's a very powerful card that had a huge effect on the meta. I'm not sure that makes Wild actually more fun. What would happen with Handlock and Blade Flurry Rogue running around in Wild? It's just one of those things that does that actually make Wild more fun? Is the meta better in Wild with those additions? I don't know. But it's something we'd have to figure out. So I'm not saying no. I'm not saying yes. It's a complicated decision. So it's and that's all predicated on whether or not we even consider this option in the first place. Okay, next question. Boar Control HS from Twitch chat.
Ooh,
Are you happy with how the meta has panned out post Mean Streets? We have 3 Patches decks on top and then Kazakus decks close behind with no Paladin and Hunter. Dean, I'm going to let you talk about that.
all right. So let's give a short history of the Mean Streets metagame. Has been early on. There was a lot of experimentation the first couple days, and then it led to a ton of Pirate Warrior. Pirate Warrior was something like 30% of the metagame, and we're like, oh, geez, like there's a lot of Pirate Warrior running around. But that fell off, quite substantially actually. Then the version of Pirates with Shaman started coming around with Jade cards, and then Rogue started popping up more recently. But in between there's a lot of Jade Druid, and then as a result of a lot of these really aggressive decks, a lot of the Reno decks started showing up. So there's been a ton of change, and when we look at that, that's great. It's like if something is very, very high population, that's okay as long as it's for a short amount of time. Now we're sort of reaching a point where at least the decks with the Pirate package, like the Warrior and the Shamans and the Rogues, those numbers are sort of stabilizing. They're stabilizing at a population that's a little bit higher than we're comfortable with. So I think that if it continues to be that way, I would expect us to do something about that. But change always happens. Like change is happening to a smaller degree with those particular decks. With the Reno decks, there's been a lot more Priest lately and a lot more Mage. Whereas early on it was just sort of the Warlock decks running Reno like in the first couple weeks there. So there's a lot of experimentation happening. There's a lot of different decks. So we are happy with that. The decks with the Pirate package, they tend to feel the same. The thing that you remember the most in our experience is what did they play in the first few turns of the game, and what did they play that finished the game. And even if there's 10 to 12 cards different, and I still feel like I'm losing to the same, 1 and 2 drop, or I still feel like I'm losing to the same win condition, those decks tend to feel so very much the same, and that's not something that we really like. We like everything to feel, much different when you're playing a different game versus a different deck. It should feel a lot different than decks you've played in the past, especially if they're different classes. So I would say we're not as happy as we could be with the population of the decks with the Pirate package. So we're looking at that very, very closely. In terms of Paladin and Hunter, so one of the Paladin decks has actually been very successful statistically. So I think that there's room there for the Paladin to really see a lot more play. Rat Pack and Dispatch Kodo are actually really, really great on rate cards. I think that because Pirates have been so fast and they're not, Paladin and Hunter with the hand buffing can be a fast deck, but not as fast as some of the Pirates, and they can't really keep up with that. So I think if that sort of tapers off, those decks have a greater chance of being played. And also, I think hand buffing has a little bit more longevity than some of the other like Jade and the Reno decks. Like Reno's going to be leaving at some point, and a lot of the Jade cards, we're not likely to print more Jade cards in the next set. Whereas a lot of the hand buffing stuff, like buffing an Acolyte of Pain. Acolyte of Pain's from the classic set, but that scales really, really well. So I think in some of the following sets as well, I think a lot of the hand buffing stuff will, if you just have a high density of creatures in your hand, or you have cards like Acolyte of Pain, I think that those sorts of mechanics they're gonna see play a lot in the next sets as well. And I've seen players like VLPS having a lot of success with Control Warrior and using cards like Doppelgangster and buffing that up as a win condition. So I've been happy with a lot of the variability in decks. I think that Paladin and Hunter specifically have been seeing a low amount of play, but the future for them I think is pretty bright as long as the meta slows down a little bit. And a lot of that is to do with the Pirate package. And if the Pirate package continues to stay the way it is in terms of population, I think that we would step in and do something about it. But in general, I've been pretty happy. There's been a lot of different decks played. A lot of the Reno stuff is awesome. That's been a core mechanic of our set. And I think that a lot of people are playing those decks, which is really awesome. A lot of people are playing Dragon Priest. Versions of Miracle Rogue are very, very popular. So there's a lot of different stuff. Last time I checked the meta report, for our personal meta report, that is that the top deck and the 11th best deck, I think that there was a like 52% to 49% win rate. So I think just in terms of balance specifically, I think that we're doing very, very well. But in terms of a lot of the decks feeling the same, I think that we could do a little bit better. So that's something that we're looking at very closely.
Sweet. Thank you, Dean. Next question here from Follow Onin from Twitter. With the second standard rotation coming up, has your stance on functionally reprinting cards changed at all? I'm not actually sure what our original stance was on that, so it's hard to say whether or not it's changed. I will say that there's to clear up some terminology here, there's the concept of reprinting, which is a funny term in a digital game, cards from sets that are in the wild, and there's the concept of functionally reprinting cards, which is basically means printing a card with a different name that has exactly the same everything else about it. So it'd be like if we printed Dr. Tentacles, who is a 7/7 for 7, who summoned 2 tentacle bots that damaged 1 to 4. So that's a functional reprint. And in Wild, what that means is you can actually play 2 Dr. Booms because they have different names. So, we haven't talked very much about either of those things. I think there's potential upside.
Your enemy spawns a terror!
I stand sentinel. The journey begins.
enough seeds. Now, let my terror grow.
Forward unto darkness.
Your enemy spawns a terror. Harvest the result of your efforts, heroes. Bring my terror to life. It's over for now, but don't get too comfortable. The infested will return again. There, your terror has come to life. Use it to harvest your enemy's corpse.
As it knows you.
Your enemy has upgraded a fort. Fort destroyed. Are you right? Enemy weak.
Close enough. There's more to do, of course.
Your enemy has destroyed a fort. Excellent. Your enemy's terror is but a husk. Admit it. You enjoy that. Your terror doesn't harm.
Do you the familiar
Night falls in 30 seconds. Are you ready for some news? That seemed personal.
None can impede fate.
Take back my seeds!
As you say.
Spill their
To a very rare reprint, or functional reprint, I guess. We haven't really talked almost at all about functional reprints, but I don't think it hasn't been quite enough time since some of the cards have entered the wild. And I think you'd have to choose the exact right moment. And I think that the times when a reprint might feel good is when a card, when in its original standard format, had a certain context. And then you take that card and you say, okay, now in this standard format, it's the same card, but it feels totally different. It plays totally differently. I think that is potentially interesting. So, and I don't know, we haven't run into those kinds of issues yet, and I just don't know if that's even a good idea, even if that's true. But I certainly don't think that we've talked enough really about either of those things. Okay, next question. Dark Scoots from Twitch chat. How do you balance designing for new players and for more experienced players? Ideally, we balance it very well. But like if you're talking about card balance, there was something we saw early on in Hearthstone's history was that Hunter was by far the best deck at like ranks 25 to 15 or something. This is back before Naxxramas, before launch actually. This is way back, and it was, I think, by far the worst deck at the top of the ladder. It was or close to it. So that's a tough balance problem, right? Because newbies are getting just stomped consistently by Hunter, and at the top end, the ladder is not as diverse as it could be because we're not seeing Hunter anywhere. So that was an issue. One of the ways we tried to solve it back then was essentially to create more skill testing cards for Hunter. If the Hunter cards are harder to play and potentially more powerful, then the great players, their win rates will increase. And because they're hard to play, bad players will start to do a little bit worse. So that's one thing that we can do to if the curve is very far off. In other cases, that's kind of been the opposite of that, where decks are very, very, very hard to play, like Patron Warrior, and the win rates at the very top end were much higher than anywhere else in the ladder. Patron Warrior was one of the worst decks for some big percentage of the lower end of the ladder. It is tough, and I think that the most important thing, though, is that there is a variety, and that we do have a good variety of skill testing decks at the top end.
Right. I think that something that we really try hard to do when we're making a new set is making sure that there's a lot of these high skill cap decks. So we have a ton of decks where you're playing creatures, and it's great to have decks where you're, what's my biggest creature that I have in my hand? What's the most powerful looking thing that I have in my hand? What's the best idea or what is the best thing for me to do here? Play that creature. I think it's great to have those kinds of decks. Not every deck can be Miracle Rogue or Freeze Mage or Patron Warrior, but at the same time, it's really important to have those decks as well. I think that something we've been trying to do recently is make Rogue and Priest sort of the decks that are more reactive. Just in general, reactive decks are slightly harder to play whenever you're playing a deck where you're holding cards in your hands and the answer is, I'm going to wait and not play these. Those decks are really, really hard to play. So when we're making a bunch of different decks, we're trying to make